The golden chandelier of the Transcorp Hilton ballroom cast a shimmering glow over the elite of Abuja. But to Zainab, the light felt like an interrogation lamp. She adjusted the sleeves of her dress, a modest floor-length emerald silk she had saved 3 months of her internship stipend to afford. She looked at Farouk, standing beside her in an Italian suit that cost more than her father's entire car fleet. For a year, she had believed his whispers of a new kind of dynasty. She believed he saw her for her mind, not her bank balance. "Zainab, come outside. The noise is too much," Farouk murmured, his hand firm on her elbow, as he guided her toward the balcony overlooking the manicured gardens. The night air was thick with the scent of blooming jasmine and expensive petrol. Farouk didn't look at her, he looked at the city skyline, the silhouette of the central business district he intended to own. "My mother has finalized the arrangement with Senator Dogo. The merger between Ishaya Properties and the Dogo Group happens next month. I am marrying Amina." Zainab felt the world tilt. "Amina? You told me she was just a family friend. You told me—" "You told you what you needed to hear to keep things pleasant," Farouk interrupted, finally turning to face her. His eyes, once warm, were now as cold as the marble floors they had just walked upon. "Look at your shoes, Zainab. Look at the scuffs on the heels. Then look at mine. I am an Ishaya. My blood demands a legacy of power, not a vibe from a girl who doesn't even have a surname worth mentioning." He pulled a slim navy blue envelope from his breast pocket. "Inside is a severance package for your time at the firm and the deed to a 2-bedroom flat in Gwarimpa. It's a good area, quiet. You are a beautiful distraction, Zainab, truly. But you aren't a queen. You aren't wife material for a man of my status." Zainab looked at the envelope. It represented the hush money for her dignity. She thought of the life she had built in Abuja, the secrets she had kept, and the royal blood currently boiling in her veins, blood Farouk was too arrogant to recognize. "You think status is something you buy in a showroom, Farouk." Her voice was a low, dangerous silk. She took the envelope. For a second, Farouk looked relieved, his Oga arrogance returning. But then Zainab walked to the edge of the balcony, right over the ornamental fountain. With a flick of her wrist, she let the envelope go. It fluttered down, soaking instantly in the water. "Keep your flat," she said, stepping close enough to see the shock in his pupils. "And keep your legacy. You'll find that when you build a house on sand, even a village girl can watch it fall." She walked away, her scuffed heels clicking loudly against the stone, leaving the billionaire standing alone in the shadows of his own ego. The rain began to lash against the window of the Bolt car, blurring the neon lights of Abuja into a smear of cold, uncaring colors. Zainab leaned her forehead against the glass, the vibration of the aging engine rattling through her skull. The driver was playing a low, melancholic Hausa song on the radio, and the melody acted like a key, unlocking a door in her mind she had kept bolted for 5 long years. As the car swerved to avoid a pothole near Area 1, Zainab wasn't in the back seat of a Toyota Corolla anymore. She was back in the ancient red-walled corridors of her father's palace in the north, the air thick with the scent of burning frankincense and the suffocating weight of 1,000 years of tradition. It had been a Tuesday, the night the moon was hidden behind heavy clouds, as if the sky itself was conspiring to help her escape. Her father, the emir, had made his decree that morning. She was to be the fourth wife of Alhaji Maikuri, a man whose skin was like parched leather and whose political influence was the only thing the emir valued more than his own daughter's happiness. "It is a sacrifice for the throne, Zainab," her father had said, his voice a deep baritone that brooked no argument. "A princess does not choose her path. She is the path upon which the kingdom walks." But Zainab had different maps in her head. While other girls in the harem practiced their embroidery, she had spent her nights hunched over textbooks, dreaming of city skylines, sustainable infrastructure, and the logic of urban planning. She didn't want to be a trophy in a rich man's house. She wanted to build the very cities those men walked through. That night, the palace was unnervingly quiet. Zainab's heart felt like a trapped bird beating against her ribs, the sound so loud she was certain the palace guards, the dogari in their red and green tunics, would hear it. She had moved with the ghost-like grace of a shadow, step-siding the creaky floorboards of the inner chambers. She stopped only once at the heavy wooden door where her younger siblings slept. A wave of crushing guilt washed over her. Who would protect them from the emir's rigid hand once she was gone? Who would tell them that there was a world beyond these walls? She bit her lip until she tasted copper, forcing herself to turn away. If she stayed, she would only be another example of a broken spirit. If she left, she could be a beacon. She reached her mother's old mahogany chest and took the only thing she had of the woman who had died giving her life, a small velvet pouch. Inside were 3 heavy gold bangles and a filigree necklace, the craftsmanship so fine it was unmistakable as royal northern gold. It was her dowry, her inheritance, and now her ticket to freedom. With her university certificates rolled tightly and tucked into a waterproof bag, she had reached the back wall of the palace grounds. The stones were cold and slick with moss. Her hands bled as she clawed her way up, the jagged edges of the masonry tearing at her skin, but she didn't feel the pain. She only felt the desperate, frantic need for a life that belonged to her. When she finally dropped onto the dusty earth on the other side of the wall, she heard her father's voice echoing from the balcony, though he wasn't physically there. It was the memory of his final warning when she had first whispered her desire to study in the city. "If you leave this palace, Zainab, you are no longer a daughter of the crown. You will be a nobody in the dust. You will find that the world does not care for a princess without her father's name." She ran until her lungs burned, catching a night bus with the commoners, the gold bangles hidden deep in her waistband. She had traded the grandeur of the palace for a tiny one-bedroom apartment in a noisy corner of Abuja, where the walls were thin enough to hear her neighbors' arguments, and the electricity was a luxury that came and went like a fickle friend. But she had been happy. She had excelled in her studies, landing an internship at the most prestigious firm in the city. She had thought she had won. She had thought Farouk Ishaya was the reward for her bravery, a man who claimed to love her for her brilliance, not her lineage. A sudden honk from a passing truck snapped Zainab back to the present. She looked down at her hands, still trembling in her lap. The emerald silk of her dress felt like a costume from a play that had just been cancelled. Farouk's words echoed the very curse her father had laid upon her 5 years ago. He had called her a village girl. He had told her she had no status. He had looked at the woman who had sacrificed a throne for her dreams and saw nothing but a beautiful distraction. The irony was a bitter pill. She had spent half a decade trying to prove she was more than a title, only to be discarded because she lacked one. She had lived in the dust, worked in the dust, and now Farouk had tried to bury her in it. The Bolt driver cleared his throat, glancing at her through the rearview mirror. "Madam, we are almost at Gwarimpa. Which gate did you say?" Zainab looked at the streetlights reflecting in the puddles. She thought of her small apartment, the piles of architectural drawings on her desk, and the empty space in her heart where she had tried to build a home with Farouk. She realized then that her father had been right about one thing. The world was a cruel place for a woman alone, but he was wrong about her being a nobody. She felt a sudden sharp pang in her lower back, a dull ache she had been ignoring all evening. She placed a hand on her stomach, her breath hitching. The secret she carried was no longer just hers. It was a bridge between the palace she had fled and the empire Farouk was so desperate to protect. Farouk wanted a dynasty. She would give him one, but it would be a dynasty he would never be allowed to touch. "Driver, don't worry about Gwarimpa," Zainab said, her voice regaining the regal steel she had tried so hard to suppress. "Take me to the North Bus Park. I'm going home." The driver looked surprised, but he nodded, spinning the steering wheel to head towards the outskirts of the city. Zainab leaned back, the gold of her mother's bangles, the ones she had never been able to bring herself to sell, clinking softly under her sleeve. She was returning to the dust, just as her father said, but she wasn't going back to be a prisoner. She was going back to reclaim her crown, for herself and for the life growing inside her. The 2 weeks following the night at the Hilton were a blur of grey skies and the mechanical rhythm of a life that no longer felt like her own. Zainab moved through the office of Ishaya Properties like a ghost haunting the corridors of her own ambition. She kept her head down, her eyes fixed on the blueprints and urban layouts on her screen, trying to drown out the office gossip that hummed like a live wire. Every staff member knew about Farouk's engagement to Amina Dogo. It was the lead story in every social diary in the country. The morning air in the office was thick with the scent of expensive coffee and the hum of the air conditioner, but for Zainab, it felt suffocating. As she leaned over a site map for a new luxury development in Maitama, a sudden violent wave of nausea surged in her chest. She barely made it to the staff restroom, her fingers scrambling against the sleek, frosted glass door. As she hovered over the sink, breathing in the sterile scent of jasmine soap, a terrifying thought took root in her mind, one that made the cold marble floor feel as though it were turning to water beneath her feet. She left the office an hour early, citing a headache. She didn't go back to her apartment. Instead, she took a taxi to a bustling pharmacy on the edge of Wuse Market, far from the prying eyes of the corporate elite. The market was a cacophony of shouting vendors, honking horns, and the heavy, humid heat of an Abuja afternoon. Usually, Zainab loved the energy of the city, the raw hustle that mirrored her own drive. But today, the weight of the city felt like it was closing in on her. Every person who brushed past her felt like a threat. Every loud voice sounded like an accusation. Inside the pharmacy, she stood in a narrow aisle, her heart hammering against her ribs. She felt small, invisible, and yet exposed. When the pharmacist handed her the small cardboard box, his eyes were neutral, but Zainab felt a searing heat of shame rise to her cheeks. She paid with trembling fingers and hurried back into the chaotic streets, clutching the bag to her chest as if it contained a ticking bomb. Back at the office the next morning, before the cleaning crews had even finished their rounds, Zainab locked herself in the handicap stall of the third-floor restroom. The minutes that followed were the longest of her life. She stared at the small plastic stick on the porcelain ledge, watching the ink bleed across the window. When the second pink line appeared, bold, defiant, and undeniable, the air left her lungs in a sharp gasp. "Positive," she whispered, the word tasting like copper. She wasn't just a discarded intern anymore. She was carrying an Ishaya heir. Despite the betrayal, a small, foolish part of her believed that Farouk needed to know. Not for the money, but because even a man as cold as him couldn't turn his back on his own blood. She walked toward the executive wing, her footsteps muffled by the thick, plush carpeting. As she approached Farouk's mahogany double doors, she was intercepted by Mrs. Benson, the head secretary. Mrs. Benson had always been kind to Zainab, but today her face was a mask of professional ice. "I need to see him, Mrs. Benson. It's urgent, it's personal," Zainab said, her voice wavering. "I'm sorry, Zainab. Mr. Ishaya is in a closed-door meeting with his mother and the Dogo family," Mrs. Benson replied, her gaze dropping to her desk. "And I have been instructed to inform you that your internship has been terminated effective immediately. All your belongings have already been cleared from your desk." The blood drained from Zainab's face. Terminated? On what grounds? Before Mrs. Benson could answer, the heavy doors opened. Hajia Hadija, Farouk's mother, stepped out. She was a woman who wore her power like armor, her lace iro and buba stiff with starch and status. Behind her stood Amina Dogo, the fiancé. Amina was breathtaking, her skin glowing, her jewelry understated but worth a fortune. She looked at Zainab not with anger, but with a devastating, soul-crushing pity. It was the look a queen gives a wounded animal on the side of the road. "You have been a very persistent girl, Zainab, but let us be clear. My son is a king in waiting. You are a distraction that has been dealt with. Your security pass has already been revoked. If you are found on these premises in 5 minutes, I will have the guards escort you out in handcuffs. Don't make this more dramatic than it needs to be." Zainab looked past the matriarch, catching a glimpse of Farouk inside the office. He was standing by the window, his back to the door. He didn't turn around. He didn't defend her. He simply let his mother's words hang in the air like a death sentence. The walk of shame out of the Ishaya building felt like a mile-long gauntlet. 2 uniformed security guards flanked her, their boots clicking rhythmically behind her. As she passed the desks of her former colleagues, she saw the whispers, the snickers, and the averted eyes. She reached the lobby, and the glass turnstiles, the very ones she had walked through a year ago with such hope, refused to turn for her. A guard had to manually swipe her out, a final public stripping of her dignity. She stood on the sidewalk of Herbert Macaulay Way, the midday sun beating down on her. She had no job, her rent was due in 3 days, and she was carrying a child whose father had just watched her be thrown out like trash. The Abuja she had fought so hard to conquer had finally spit her out. The independence she had cherished now felt like a lonely, cold prison. She thought of her father. She thought of the red walls of the palace and the silent, heavy peace of the north. She remembered his warning about being nobody in the dust. She had tried to be somebody, and the world had crushed her for it. "I can't do this alone," she sobbed into her hands, the noise of the city drowning out her grief. "I'm sorry, Baba. I'm coming home." She hailed a passing taxi, her mind made up. She would face the Emir. She would face the judgment, the confinement, and the shame, because in the heart of the North, at least, she was a daughter of a king, and her son would be born a prince, even if he had to be a hidden one. The night bus out of Abuja was a metal capsule of broken dreams. Rattling through the darkness toward a past Zainab had tried to outrun. As the bus crested the hills, leaving the Federal Capital Territory, the air through the cracked window began to change. The humid, heavy scent of the city, a cocktail of exhaust fumes and ambition, slowly thinned out, replaced by the dry, sharp bite of the harmattan. By the time the first streaks of dawn touched the horizon, the lush greenery of the Middle Belt had surrendered to the vast, open savanna. The sight of the ancient, crenulated city walls of her childhood home rising out of the morning mist felt like a punch to the stomach. They were magnificent, timeless, and utterly indifferent to her suffering. When the bus dropped her at the motor park, Zainab felt like a ghost returning to a world that had already moved on. She took a tricycle toward the palace, her heart hammering against her ribs with every rotation of the wheels. The closer she got, the more the architecture tightened its grip on her soul. The grand archways and the intricate mud relief patterns on the walls spoke of a power that didn't need skyscrapers or corporate boardrooms to assert itself. She stood before the massive iron-studded gates of the emir's palace, her small suitcase at her side. The two Dogari guards, draped in their ceremonial red and green robes, straightened as she approached. One of them, an older man named Musa, who had once carried her on his shoulders when she was a toddler, narrowed his eyes. The recognition was instant, followed quickly by a deep cultural sorrow. "I have come to see my father," Zainab said, her voice cracking like dry parchment. Musa looked away, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "The emir has no daughter here. He only has petitioners who seek his mercy." He disappeared through a small side door, leaving Zainab standing in the mountain heat. 10 minutes later, he returned with a message that felt like a whip across her back. "The emir says the woman at the gate, if she wishes to be a daughter again, she must first learn what it means to be a subject. She will wait with the others." Zainab looked at the long line of villagers, farmers, and widows sitting in the dirt against the palace wall, waiting for an audience that might never come. For a moment, her Abuja pride flared. The iron lady who had stared down real estate moguls wanted to scream. But then she felt the flutter in her womb, a tiny reminder of why she was there. She lowered herself onto the hard, dusty ground, her emerald silk dress staining with the red earth of the north. The 12-hour vigil began. The sun rose into a white-hot orb, baking the courtyard. The dust of 1,000 years seemed to settle into the pores of her skin. Thirst became a living thing, a jagged stone in her throat, but she did not move. She watched the shadows of the palace towers stretch and shrink, then stretch again. The villagers whispered, their voices like the dry rustle of maize stalks in the wind. "Is that not the one who ran? The one who thought she was bigger than the crown?" "See how the city has broken her," a man replied, spitting into the dust. "She went out a lioness and returns a stray dog." Zainab closed her eyes, letting the insult wash over her. She realized then that her father wasn't just testing her patience, he was stripping away the Zainab of Abuja until only the daughter remained. By the 10th hour, her head was light and the world was a blur of heat and hunger. By the 12th hour, as the call to the Maghrib prayer echoed from the minarets, the palace's chief of staff, a man whose face was a map of ancestral loyalty, appeared. "The emir will see you now." Zainab tried to stand, but her legs buckled. She had to crawl to her feet, leaning against the cold stone of the gate. She was led through the labyrinthine corridors, past courtiers who averted their eyes, and finally into the great throne room. The air inside was cool and heavy, with the scent of aged leather and oud. Her father sat upon the elevated dais, a silent mountain of white brocade and authority. His turban was wrapped so tightly that only his piercing, dark eyes were visible. She did not stop in the middle of the room like a princess would. She walked until she reached the foot of the dais and sank to her knees, pressing her forehead against the cool floor. She was a beggar in the house where she was born. The bird that flies too high often forgets where the nest is, until the hawk strikes and it remembers that the ground is the only thing that does not move. Zainab did not look up. "The bird has broken its wings, Baba. It has nowhere else to land. You left this palace claiming you would build your own world. You said the old ways were chains. Why have you returned to the blacksmith who forged them?" Zainab took a shuddering breath. The silence that followed was so thick, it felt like a physical weight. "I returned because I realized that a tree without roots cannot withstand a storm. And because—" I paused, her voice dropped to a whisper that echoed in the vast hall. "Because
"There is a new branch growing. I am with child, Baba, and Ishaya heir." The silence that followed was deafening. It wasn't the silence of peace, but the silence of a gathering storm. The courtiers held their breath. The only sound was the faint tinkle of the crystal chandeliers. For a long minute, the emir did not move. Then he slowly stood, his massive frame casting a shadow that swallowed Zainab whole. "A child," he whispered, the word carrying a mixture of fury and a strange hidden grief. He stepped down from the dais, his heavy robes rustling. He stopped just inches from her bowed head. "You ask for forgiveness, Zainab. But forgiveness is like a river. It only flows where the land is humble enough to receive it. You will stay, but you will not be a princess in this palace. You will be a shadow until the child is born. If the child is a lion, perhaps the pride will accept him. If he is a cub of the dust, you both will be forgotten." Zainab let out a breath she felt she had been holding for 5 years. She was home. She was safe. But as she looked at her father's cold, unyielding eyes, she knew the real battle had only just begun. She wasn't just surviving anymore. She was playing for her son's future.
The inner quarters of the palace became a gilded cage where the air was thick with the scent of sandalwood and the unspoken bitterness of women who had forgotten the world outside. Zainab was no longer the princess of the people. She was a ghost in a silk wrap, forbidden from using the royal name and relegated to a small, sparse room at the far end of the courtyard. Her life was measured by the 5 daily prayers and the subtle cruelties of her father's other wives. Hajia Fatima, the senior wife, treated her like a stain on the family carpet, her eyes narrowing every time Zainab's growing belly became visible under her abaya. But it was the pity from the younger wives that stung more. The way they whispered about the Abuja girl who had flown too close to the sun and come back with burnt wings. Zainab did not fight them with words. While the other women spent their afternoons debating the latest lace patterns or palace gossip, Zainab retreated into the depths of the palace library, a dusty, forgotten hall filled with ancient manuscripts and neglected colonial-era land records. She spent months hunched over yellowed maps and deed registries, her fingers tracing the boundaries of the Emirates' ancestral holdings. Her urban planning degree, once a source of her father's shame, became her greatest weapon. She discovered that a consortium of developers, under the guise of modernization, had been systematically undervaluing the Emirates' land for a decade. As she scanned the names of the parent companies involved, her heart stopped. There, in faded ink on a recent proposal, was a subsidiary of Ishaya Properties. Farouk wasn't just the man who broke her heart. His family was actively leeching off her father's heritage. The betrayal was now professional as well as personal. As her pregnancy progressed, the Harmattan season arrived with a vengeance. The wind blew from the Sahara, carrying a fine white dust that coated everything in a chalky shroud and turned the sun into a pale, ghostly coin. It was during the peak of this storm, when the wind howled through the palace turrets like a mourning widow, that Zainab's labor began. The pain was a jagged lightning bolt that tore through her, grounding her to the floor of her small room. The birth was a grueling, hours-long battle. The palace midwives whispered incantations as the dust rattled against the window panes, threatening to shatter the glass. Zainab gripped the bedposts, her knuckles white, refusing to scream. She would not give the women in the courtyard the satisfaction of hearing her break. In the final shattering moment of agony, a sharp cry pierced the roar of the wind. The head midwife cleaned the child and placed him in Zainab's exhausted arms. He was beautiful, a perfect blend of northern royalty and the man who had discarded her. But when he opened his eyes, Zainab felt a chill that had nothing to do with the Harmattan.
They were the Ishaya eyes, piercing, intelligent, and amber-flecked. She named him Omar. In the quiet aftermath, she looked up to see a tall, silhouetted figure in the doorway. It was the emir. He did not enter, but his presence filled the room. He looked at the baby, then at the daughter he had tried to erase. "Baba," Zainab whispered, her voice rasping but steady. "I have seen the ledgers. Your partners from the city are thieves. They think you are a relic of the past, so they treat your land like a carcass. I am the only one who knows their language. I am the only one who can stop them." The emir's eyes moved from the baby to the stacks of land records Zainab had piled by her bed. "And what do you ask for, daughter who is no longer named?" "A loan," she said, clutching Omar tighter. 5 million naira. I will build a firm, Z.B. Royal Holdings. I will protect this land and I will grow this money until it is a mountain. I don't want your pity, Baba. I want your investment." The emir sat silent for a long time, the dust swirling in the corridor behind him. He looked at the boy with the billionaire's eyes and the mother with the warrior's spirit. For the first time in 5 years, he gave a slow, solemn nod. "The money will be sent. But remember, Zainab, a lion that leaves the pride must eventually face the hyenas alone." 10 years later, the Abuja sun beat down on a sleek black motorcade pulling up to a construction site in the heart of the city. Farouk Ishaya stepped out of his car, looking older, his face etched with the stress of a collapsing empire. His status marriage had failed, his political ties were fraying, and a mysterious competitor had been outbidding him on every major land deal in Nigeria for the last 3 years. He walked towards the site office, desperate to meet the elusive CEO of Z.B. Royal Holdings, to beg for a partnership that would save his company from bankruptcy. The door opened, and a young boy, about 10 years old, walked out. He was dressed in a miniature traditional babariga, walking with a regal confidence that stopped Farouk in his tracks. The boy looked up, and Farouk felt his heart stop. He was looking into his own eyes. "Are you the man who wants to see my mother?" the boy asked, his voice calm and commanding. Before Farouk could speak, a woman stepped out of the shadows behind the boy. She was draped in gold and emerald silk, her face more beautiful and terrifying than he remembered. "He isn't just a man, Omar," Zainab said, her voice like velvet-covered steel. "He is a stranger who is about to lose everything." The secrets are out, and the hunt has begun. Will Farouk realize who Umar is before Zainab destroys his empire? Or will the emir's warning come true? Is Zainab truly alone against the hyenas? Don't miss the explosive conclusion in part 2. Comment "Revenge" below if you want the next part immediately.